All right, everyone, the next talk is going to start very soon. So first, thanks to our bronze sponsor, Aikido. It's an all-in-one, no-nonsense AppSec platform, and you can see which issue matters and how to fix them from cloud to code. And today we are going to welcome Marcus and Attila from the Spotify security team. They're going to talk to us about multi-cloud security.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Atilla Dulovics. I'm Senior Security Engineer in Spotify Cloud Security Team. And today with me is Marcus Hallberg, and we will talk about our lesson learned from the field during why we work with the GCP and AWS Identity Federation, as well as a cross-cloud forensic and incident response. But before we jump into the details, please allow us for short introductions. I'm an engineer who is fan for codified solutions and passionate about the multi-cloud, and my secret skills is a Hungarian language, as I'm a Hungarian originally, and I'm handed over to Marcus.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I'm also a big passionate person for cloud security, also forensics and a lot of the other things we have talked about today. Also, I have a secret skill, which is I know how to do Swedish folk dancing. So if there's any of you enthusiasts in the audience, no. Maybe at the afterward, guys, okay? No promises, okay? That's how we do it. We can't do that now. That wouldn't be serious. We're here for serious things. Anyhow, that's me. So just to give you guys a little understanding of what company we're representing and how we work with cloud. So we're present in multiple clouds, but our heavy load is usually in Google Cloud. So we're present in all of Google's 5 regions across. We're heavily using things like Kubernetes and containerized infrastructure, where we're running 100 and 1,000 clusters with up to 4,000 nodes per cluster. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of compute workload to make sure that all of our customers can listen to music and enjoy our services daily. Last but not least, we have more than 4,000 services deployed, which we're also using across. And as a fun fact, we have more than 60,000 service accounts. How do we secure those? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, to give you just a quick agenda, what we're going to cover today. So we're going to go through the journey we took when it comes to cross-cloud identity federation, specifically talking about Google Cloud and AWS. We're going to cover the strategy that we followed in making sure this worked. What were the highlights and hiccups that we learned along the way as we made this journey together? And last but not least, we're going to cover a use case for how we can see some of the methods we looked at can be used for things like incident response and forensics. So let's start from the beginning. Why did we look into cross-cloud identity federation? And just to get a sense of the audience, how many in here has worked with identity federation in some way, shape, or form? Okay, quite a few hands. Perfect. Now, we won't cover this topic in general, because I'm sure all of you are familiar with identity federation in general. But just to kind of highlight a few of the differences that need to be aware of when we consider GCP and AWS. So if we start by having an identity in AWS that we want to federate identity for to GCP, there's a couple of things we need to bear in mind. So we start off by the credentials that we'll have, for which we can get an identity token that we later then can exchange to a federated token in GCP, which we finally use to get the access token we need. Now, once we have the access token, we effectively have the permissions associated in GCP, and we have made that federation happen. Now, if we flip the table and go the other way around, and we start off in GCP and instead want to go to AWS, the steps are a bit similar, but as you can see, there is one step less in the sense that now we can use the ID token and the Web Identity Token Exchange to get the STS credentials directly. So there are small nuances and differences, but all of these things were things that we had to bear in mind for the upcoming solution that we wanted to build. But I want to take a step back here and hand it back to Attila, who will explain what were the main motivations that we had when we embarked on this journey.
Thank you. So our team has a long-running effort for reducing service account keys in our environment and replacing with keyless solution where it was feasible. By looking at our environment, we have more than 5,000 GCP projects. less significant the AWS account numbers, but still exist in our ecosystems. We have AWS access key, what we needed to look after that, more than 60,000 service account and 40,000 service account keys. So by addressing the needs of these static credentials and replacing with a keyless solution, we feel that it would be a good gain for us from security perspective. And the other motivation we have is more like for experimenting in our in-house service-to-service authentication in a cross-cloud environment, where basically you can use one of the service identity to communicate with another services by using authorization and authentication in the first place before you accepting any calls. But what strategy did we follow? So every discovery work requires a good plan for not losing the details. So we picked up 4 easy milestones for ourselves. First, we have the first steps, acquiring the knowledge. We need to know what is the developer pain point, what we need to build, what needs to be addressed from integration point of view. If we know that what we are requiring from our users, try to build the capability to make their life is much easier. And if we are making their life easier, we're making the adaptation more appealing because they have more time to focus for their development, application logic, and less headache for figuring out the infrastructure need or IAM configuration for that. And for not dropping the ball, every product as good as their support, so we wanted to make sure that we're providing them enough guidance for a long-running support. But as every journey starting the first steps, so what was our questions during our knowledge discovery? So what do we need to configure as an identity federations? What is the actual developer pain points, what we need to look after that? And what threats should we consider? By looking for the first questions for configuration needs for establishing identity federation is different for AWS and different for GCP. It's obvious as it's 2 different cloud providers, 2 different mindset when they are build their architecture. But for AWS, as in the pre-existing infrastructure need is not much, because you can now use for the web identity federation, as Marcus previously mentioned, out of the box. And if you're familiar for building the trust policy, you basically can allow your GCP identity communicate with AWS. Meanwhile, for GCP, if you want to support for any cloud providers as identity providers, you need to build workload identity providers and workload identity pool, and also need to figure it out what attributes you want to be mapped to the identity. As looking for these questions is already overwhelming by looking just from security perspective, what can goes wrong, and if you put it as a context switching, usually as a developer, okay, I need to do this and need to consider that, and I also need to deliver my application. So it's usually they are overwhelming. And if you are putting in one extra thing on top of that, when you have your own solutions, and after that the security guys come in the pictures, have you considered the threats? Yeah, that's the point when they get disappointed about our reach out. So let's look for the threats. 3 major threats, what I would like to say should be considered by in the first case. Spoofing, when you're pretending you are not who you are. You are privilege escalations, more like doing something you are not allowed to do that. And repudiation, basically you can deny that you do that. And when we look for basically the IAM levels, what we're requiring from the users to place in the AWS trust policy, we came out a suggestion for that. Please use the service account emails as one of the condition keys. Please use the unique IDs. Why the unique IDs? Because the unique ID is basically tied to the service account when it's created. So if somebody accidentally did it and recreating the service account is also breaking the previously defined trust. So in that case, we make sure that the trust policy that was created one time in the past is usually serving the same trust was originally intended. And also we had one extra suggestion from our developers, more like using the audience field as well for dedicated generated session names, which later help us for identifying these sessions in the cloud tails. By looking for the other side, for the GCP, the first questions that came out that, okay, how we can identify a service, what is the service identity. Should we look for the IAM users, should be for the IAM roles, and we agreed that the IAM role is the closest things what we can say for the service account, but also by looking for how we are defining the workload identity. Providers and pools, we discovered that, okay, we want to have a requirement from our developers, please do different identity providers and pools for each of your AWS account, because this is how we can avoid to have more like subject collisions when we are mapping the IAM role names. So we make sure that all of the action is paired from the identity where is on the other side in the AWS and no overlapping between them. Now we know what we are requiring from our developers, so let's eat what we are cooked. And as part of that, we came out of 4 easy bullet points what we wanted to follow up. We only wanted to focus on the developer pain points, addressing their needs, and also what is the gap in the integration part, the wide applicability, use as many places as possible, low maintenance, and smooth implementation. By keeping these 4 things in our mind, we came out with 2 tools with a 2 different scope. One of them is the ID Exchange, which is basically using for GCP service account and replacing with AWS credentials and deriving the credential file in the GCP environment. It's a simple Python CLI tool, as I mentioned, can be used as part of the base images and relying on AWS CLI sourcing external credentials. So in our documentation, we're recommending adding for their Docker images if you needed to communicate with the AWS environment and use these tools by head on the fly your AWS credentials, and the AWS CLI will be covering for the credential renewals. Meanwhile, we have the other side, the infrastructure part, in a need for making our house in order. So we came out a simple VPET tool, which is, I would say, is infrastructure as a code solution in terms of is generating a blueprint for baking best practices for workload identity pool and provider creations by requiring a developer's 2 parameters, which is already in their context, like their IAM role name and also the service account, which basically is the both end of the bridge for the communications. And if you are not familiar with the Kubernetes config connector, is kind of the similar things as AWS CloudFormation, but for Mono Kubernetes, where you are controlling over your GCP environment. But every product as good as their offering and also their support. And what was our selling point to our developers is more like, you don't need to think about credential rotations. You not get better for the security every year that, hey, have you considered to rotate your access keys because it's more than 365 days old? Also reduce the configuration head. You don't need to look after for the cloud providers documentations. You just need to follow up the established best practices and tools. And also we simplified the IAM management as part of the federated identities, more like if they needed to create the IAM bindings, they was able to use our repository solution with the infrastructure as a code. If they needed to considering about the API calls, what they need to do for identity federation, it was covered by the ID Exchange. But as for the support, we also wanted to make sure that our effort is not disappearing during the time. So we created a clear documentations. Each side requires, each identity federation for each side requires only for 5 steps for our developers. So we reduce their context overload in that terms. The tool offering is also supporting for the teams and the developers same times. And as we are ingested for the session name as an audience, we also managed to have some traceability in the logging as well. But every journey has ups and downs as ours, so let's see the dark truth. We had a moderate adaptation after our POC customers, so by considering our environment size and how many identity federations are we use between services is not much, but we already known that the adaptation would be not so high as it's a special needs inside the company and also addressing the needs from For me, it's a legacy AWS environment, what we inherited for certain acquisition processes, and they needed this kind of cross-cloud communications. We also faced some unexpected challenges like GCP to AWS communications. One of the interesting ones that previously defined OpenID Connect, it took over precedence for STS Web Identity. I think it took a few hours to figure it out why the correct configuration is not working and why the STS is always messing with my calls. Also, we had some issue around the custom credential providers in Apache Beam frameworks or Jib usage, which is basically managed Docker build services for Java applications, and that was more like motivated us also porting our solution for Java libraries. As well, for AWS GCP, the FARKit workload compatibility for Google Out library, where the metadata endpoint is different than EC2. But for WINS, we also had simplified AWS organization-wide access from GCP, like reducing the number, how many steps do you need for communicating from GCP to AWS, from 3 steps to 1. And over the time, we got some good feedback from other teams who managed to build on our experimentation and discovery work and building blocks for extending the service-to-service authentication in a multi-cloud environment by utilizing AWS API Gateway, IAM, authentication and our in-house solution. But mentioning building blocks, there are also other things that we can look after for the forensic point of view, and I'm handing to back Markus.
Thank you. So, as you've seen, it's been a long journey. We're not there yet, but we have made some significant steps along the way, both making our company more secure, but also making the life easier for our developers that has to work across cloud. Now, to kind of wrap this up, we want to give one final example to leave you all with, and how we can see this being used for incident response and forensics cross-cloud. So, if we go back to one of the previous examples we mentioned, so let's say that we have in GCP a service account that we want to leverage to do incident response or forensics in AWS. Now, if we have that set up using either identity pools or static keys for credentials to get access, together with a dedicated IAM role in AWS, we can then use the method called AssumeRoleWithWebIdentity that AWS offers us to get that access and get the permissions that the IAM role has. Now, this setup allows us to do a couple of different things. And to kind of bring back one of the examples that Attila gave, when we have the AWS trust policy, it's really important how we define those conditions to make sure that we have those permissions set and federated in the proper way. So we heard, for example, in Sebastian's talk, how do we secure identity federation cross-cloud? And this is really where we have spent a lot of time to make sure we have the proper traces and logs for this, so that whenever we do federation, we can have a proper trail of how that took place. Last but not least, we wanted to leave you with a couple of methods for how we can do the actual authentication. Now, depending on if you're working as us as a security engineer or if you're working as a service provider doing forensics for other organizations, there's obviously a need to automate the authentication as much as possible. So from the methods we have tested to start from high automation to low, we can leverage this using the standardized APIs that are available together with HTTP requests. We can use our own self-signed token if we have the credentials for that, or we can do a setup similar to what we did with ID Exchange and instead use the cloud SDKs, allowing us maybe a bit less of automation in terms of we have to build those SDKs with a proper service to carry out the federation and forensics or response, but still allowing us for some leeway there. And last but not least, if we need to do, say, ad hoc investigations and instead using the cloud CLIs, we have an opportunity to do that as well. That was a lot of information. How many loves identity federation right now? I have a few hands. Thank you so much. So this is a lot of good information. We kind of wanted to leave you all with a small token of ours, which is that we have put some of the code that we have made for this setup into this GitHub repository. So what we say is, go and test this yourselves and set it up and tinker with it. We'll be here for questions. And thank you all for listening, both here and remote. Thanks all the sponsors and organizers. And we're here for any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one question on Slack. Are you going to open source the ID exchange or whip it, the tool that you mentioned?
So as far as we know, right now, that is an internal tool. And because of that fact, we can't really open source the whole part of it. Otherwise, we are as a company, we're very heavy into open source. And that's why we have made the parts of this setup that we can basically share. That's what we have included in the GitHub repository.
Another question from Slack. Can you share a bit more on why Spotify is multi-cloud and how that makes incident response more challenging?
Mm-hmm. Want to take that?
Yeah, I can take the first part and you can take the second. So why we are multi-cloud, we also look for how we can be more independent for the cloud providers in one piece. And also, as we are expanded, we also acquired companies who build their solution in the AWS environment. So this is why I mentioned that if you're considering how many GCP projects we have versus how many AWS accounts, but as a security teams and domains, we also need to oversee for all of the environment. So we have a little bit a mixed bag of cloud providers, what we need to consider and cover, and some of them is more like coming from acquisitions, some of them specific business needs for, I want to use that services because it's a better offering for us.
Yeah. And just to cover the second part quickly, when it comes to things like incident response cross-cloud, we as an organization have a lot of commercial tools that we also use. But part of this research was to show that it's a few different methods that we still can leverage, both when it comes to automating this using favorite SOAR platform or anything else, or doing ad hoc investigations as well. So bundling all of that together, we have a lot of tools that we can then use, but also that we want to share with the community for how to do this themselves.
Is there any questions from the room?
Hey, great talk. Just a quick question on, usually a lot of people have struggled with roles itself. You guys obviously had a lot of accounts, a lot of service accounts. Were there things you had to do specifically for the different types of role across different businesses before you got onto the project? Curious to know how you guys tackled it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You can take it if you want.
So I think I'll try to answer it, and then we'll see if it was a good answer or not. So from the journey we took, I would say when we started in the kind of cross-cloud setup, because we had we had different workloads in different clouds, we had made acquisitions along the way. So basically, our IAM landscape was looking, it was looking interesting. Let's just call it like that. So what we have tried to do now, and I hope this answers your question, is that we have tried to define very clearly what roles that are needed, both in any cloud we run, but especially for the identity federation piece. So rather than having the teams have different types of setup for their own purpose, we try to make that a standard, both when it comes to the roles and how they are defined, federated, and updated. So we do all that centrally. But also, as we showed here, the method for how to do the actual federation as well. But I'll pause there, and I want to make sure I answer your question. Okay, I got a thumbs up. Great.
Any other question? Okay, so thanks again, Marcus and Attila, and the next talk will be...
Oh. I was about to say thank you for being here.
Almost got to.
But let's cover the last one for sure.
Sorry, just a quick one. So when it comes to workload identity federation in a native GCP world, we're obviously using that to reduce the number of hardcore credentials that we have to assign to service accounts. So I guess the solution that you've sort of talked about today, you've managed to do that in the GCP world anyway with workload identity federation. I'm sorry if I missed it, but have you actually managed to reduce the number of hardcore credentials that you need in AWS as well?
Right, so the hardcore keys, like the service account keys in AWS, if we have managed to reduce those, is that the question?
Yes.
Right. You want to answer?
For EC2 instances, yes, we managed to address for a few of them, but not all of them, because they use more like a data flow job or some long-running batch jobs where there was existed. And the recent findings what we had for the Fargate, for EC2, EKS Fargate services, that they're using a different metadata services. So it's requiring us some improvement around that, how we can provide an external credential providers better for those services. But in a short answer, if you're using the Google Out libraries, they are kind of prepared for working in an AWS environment if you generated the credentials from the workload identity pools, and you can just give it your developers, and they not contains any secrets in that sense. But if you are using for EKS Fargate services, that would be fair because the Out library is not really prepared for the Fargate containers pod metadata link.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Attila.